Yeah, so talking about Dzogchen, the Dzogchen teachings or the Dzogchen approach seem to have a very different way of theorizing and also applying Buddha nature through the Tekchö practices. I think you translate that as breakthrough, if I'm not wrong, and then the Tögel, direct transcendence practice. Is unlike even the sort of Anuttara Yoga tantras, other sort of big tantric treatment of Buddha nature theory and practice, the Dzogchen system seem to have a very different take on actualizing Buddha nature. Can you elaborate a bit on that, how the Dzogchen sort of approaches vis-a-vis Buddha nature?
I think when we think about Dzogchen, it's really important to realize that it's a family group of traditions that are very, very different from each other. And so from this time period of the 8th century, when it's pretty clear that Dzogchen begins to emerge in Tibet, and then through the 14th century, there are so many different traditions that fall under this category that we now think of as Dzogchen. And some of them call themselves as Dzogchen. Some of them called themselves primarily by other terms, like they called themselves the Chiti, the crown pith, or they called themselves the Yangti Nakpo, the black quintessence, or the Brahmse core, the cycle of the Brahmins, and the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition, or the seminal heart tradition. So there were all these different traditions that were bound together. And I think the one that obviously emerged as historically most influential, and which was the one that did the most interesting things, I think by far, with Buddha nature theory and practice, was the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition. And so that's what, when you talk about Tekchö and Tögel, these two forms of contemplative practice that both work directly with Buddha nature ideas and realities, those are both terms and practices that emerge in the 11th century with the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition. And so in the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition, I think the way to start thinking about Buddha nature there is really to think about creation or divine creation, because I think divine creation is what characterizes the way that Dzogchen Nyingtik takes Buddha nature and makes it at the very heart of a complex philosophical and contemplative system. And so if we step back and we understand the nature of divine creation for the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition in the 11th century going into the 14th century, then I think everything else begins to fall in place. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and just to give some basics about it, karmic creation is a more dominant form in Indian Buddhism that we hear a lot about in philosophical circles. It's all over the Abhidharma Kosha and so many other materials, where basically the creation of life, the creation of the worlds, the creation of in general, the paradigm is a karmic paradigm. That creation happens because of volitionally, emotionally infused volitional acts by life, by body, speech, and mind, and so forth. And the consequences of those actions are what create our bodies, they create our minds, they're what drive us from death across rebirth into reincarnational forms. They also drive the formation of galaxies. They have these notion of 4 eons, where eons are created, they endure, they're destroyed, and then they're just empty for a long time. And after they're empty for a long time, what causes the galaxy and the worlds to reemerge? It's the stirrings of karmic residue, the residue of all those volitional acts of living beings over time. And so that's something we talk a lot about, like karmic creation and the karmic paradigm, the whole notion of the 12 interdependent links of co-emergent origination, or codependent origination, is about karmic consequences and karmic causation and so forth. But there is another model that's all over Indian Buddhism that we don't often kind of thematize enough, and that's a divine model of creation. And that divine model of creation is something that was really transparent in imperial Buddhism in Tibet in the 8th century and the 9th century. We see it with the mandalas, the Mahavairochana mandalas. We see it in the Maha Yoga works, the deity yoga stuff. We see it in the Buddha nature scriptures and so forth. And we also see it in the great visionary Mahayana sutras like the Avatamsaka Sutra and those other sutras that have these beautiful scene setting beginnings of the sutras, where you have these visions of Buddhas across the galaxies that are connected by rays of light, and the notion of Pure Lands, where Buddhas create Pure Lands and they engage in divine acts of creation and so forth. So that divine act of creation, I think, is really critical to understanding Dzogchen thought and practice. And what they do with it is they ask the question, how do we go from nothing to something? How does the world emerge? How does life emerge? How does the mind emerge? And they go to the emergence of Buddha, of bodies out of Buddhas, the three kaya theory of Buddhas, that there's a Dharmakaya, a Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya. And so the Dharmakaya is this matrix of emptiness. And what happens is out of those, these Pure Land Sambhogakaya Buddhas, these enjoyment Buddhas, they emerge. And that, for the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition, is the very basis of what they think of as the nature of creation, the nature of divine creation. And that's what Buddha nature is for them. Buddha nature is the presence of that divine creation within all forms of life. And it's constantly active. It's not inert. It's constantly spilling over into these arrays of Pure Lands and then Nirmanakaya Buddhas and so forth. And so when you look at the philosophical system in the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition, you have, I think of it as like 9 different places where this divine creation, and I'll stop talking after I give you the 9. So these 9 contexts in which this divine creation happens. The first 3 are about beginnings, the second 3 are about middles, and the last 3 are about ends. So in terms of beginnings, cosmogony, how does the world begin? Literally, how does the world begin? And they talk about a primordial ground that's original purity and spontaneity. And that original ground is nothing in its own right. And yet out of it, the world flows into what's called the appearance of the ground, or the presencing of the ground. And it's described as a youthful vase Buddha body in which primordial knowing stirs, and then the seal breaks open in the vase and the world emerges. And what does the world look like? The world looks like a divine set of Pure Lands. And then if those Pure Lands are recognized by the awareness that emerges in the same process, then you have enlightenment. If it's not recognized, you have unawareness, marikpa, and you have the emergence of samsara. So cosmogony. And then cosmology. If freedom happens, that's what the story of the primordial Buddha, Samantabhadra, Kundu Sampo, literally all good, the all good Buddha. The all good Buddha is that awareness which in the very beginning of the universe essentially recognizes the nature of those appearances as intrinsically self. And so he or it becomes freed. And so you have this whole story of cosmology and how these worlds then emerge, and how that Buddha becomes these massive cosmological Buddhas in which galaxies are held. And then finally, for beginnings, you have embryology. The Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition talks about the nature of, sorry, just 1 second. He's not going to shut up, but embryology, when they talk about the formation of the human body, typically Buddhist accounts will talk about karma driving it. But in the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition, they talk about 2 small eyes, the eye of the lamps and the eye of the elements. And the eyes are Buddha eyes. They're used the honorific form of the word eye. And those Buddha eyes are the presence of the Buddha nature and primordial knowing that actually drive the formation of an embryo in a mother's womb. So you see at every level, the Buddha nature is profoundly active. And then I won't go through the others in detail, but in the middle, physiology. How do they explain the human body? They explain it as a series of channels of light that go throughout the body, and through which the Buddha nature in our heart is constantly manifesting and spilling out with gnosis and bodies that run throughout our rays of light, or our channels of light in the body. Psychology, when they talk about how the mind works, they talk about the relationship of the Dharmakaya to the Alaya Vijnana, this universal ground of ordinary knowing and cognition. And they say that the primary thing is the Dharmakaya. It's in our heart right now, and it's generating the psychic energy that becomes the Alaya Vijnana, that becomes the basis for ordinary knowing when we fail to recognize it. And then epistemology, how do we know the world? They talk about the senses as gateways of primordial knowing, literally how you translate yeshe, which is the knowing of a Buddha. and that the Buddha nature in our heart projects out through these gateways into the world around us where we can see them. And then finally, the three N's, soteriology, like how do we become enlightened? How do we become liberated? And all of the main contemplative practices in Dzogchen are about Buddha nature and how we work with Buddha nature in a contemplative context. And we can talk in more detail about that. And then the second kind of end is dying. So the conventional explanation of dying in Indian Buddhism is you die, and then your karma leads you to be rebirth and so forth. And the Dzogchen Nyingtik explanation of dying is completely different. Instead of saying it's all about karma, they say it's all about the Buddha nature, that in the moment of death, our internal Buddha nature is revealed and we have systemic experiences of it. First in the form of radiant light, and then in the form of peaceful Buddhas and wrathful Buddhas. And only if we fail to recognize those does karma then take over and recreate our birth in samsara. And then finally, in the 11th, 12th century, there's accounts of the final ends of the universe, where it says, like, you know, after endless numbers of bodhisattvas have worked to essentially liberate every sentient being, and there's no sentient being left to be liberated, it says that the Nirmanakaya Buddha's bodies, the emanational bodies, they coil up into the enjoyment bodies, and the enjoyment bodies coil up into the Dharmakaya, and the Dharmakaya coils up into the Dharma Dhatu, the expanse of reality. And finally, all there is primordial knowing, or Yeshe, which is a Buddha's knowing. And so anyway, so you can see that's how the whole system originates. It builds an entire system of thought and practice that explains everything in traditional Buddhist topics through the lens of this Buddha nature, which is constantly engaged in divine acts of creation.
Wow. Well, so the ground you're talking about, isn't it? The Shi, which is the Buddha nature, and everything being, as you put it, radiation of the awareness. So almost everything being reduced to Buddha nature, it's, what do you call it? Cell, dung, is expression, radiation.